June 4th, 1943, over the skies of Europe, the air vibrated with the metallic rhythm of 50 caliber guns. To the men inside the flying fortresses, survival depended not just on courage, but on mathematics, the invisible geometry of lead and speed. They had learned to aim not where the enemy was, but where he would be. This revelation, taught in dusty desert classrooms and tested in skies streaked with fire, changed the course of aerial combat forever. It was a science born from desperation and perfected through discipline. From the frozen waste positions of B-17s over Germany to the shimmering heat of gunnery schools in Texas. Each tracer line was a lesson in physics, each burst of fire a split-second calculation between life and death. Behind every confirmed kill lay a story of precision, training, and nerve, of gunners who faced swarming fighters with nothing but their instincts and the steady rotation of a Sperry computing gun sight. This is the story of how American gunners learned to fire ahead of the target and turned the air war in their favor. May 1st, 1943. Over the cold Atlantic, the morning sky was pale and washed in light, a thin veil of mist clinging to the horizon where the coast of France waited. 10 B-17. Flying fortresses held formation, their wings steady, their engines droning with the synchronized rhythm of mechanical faith. In the belly of one of those bombers, a ship called the Mary Ruth, Memphis Belle's big sister, a young ball turret gunner named Maynard Smith adjusted the twin handles of his 50 caliber machine guns and tried not to think about the odds. It was his first mission. He was small for his position, barely 5.5 feet tall, compact enough to fit inside the cramped steel sphere hanging beneath the bomber's fuselage. The others called him Snuffy, a nickname born from his stubbornness and his knack for breaking rules when he thought they made no sense. The Army Air Forces had plenty of men who followed orders. They needed men who could keep calm inside a spinning coffin at 25,000 feet. Smith had learned to fight fires, tend wounds, and calculate the deflection of a target, all before most men had even seen combat. The morning briefing had been clear. The target was the German submarine base at Saint-Nazaire, nicknamed the Flak Trap of Europe. The Luftwaffe guarded it ferociously. Anti-aircraft batteries, radar towers, and coastal guns covered the approaches like invisible jaws. No one expected this run to be easy. The crews knew it could be their last. As the B-17s approached the coastline, the first bursts of flak appeared, black puffs blossoming around the formation, followed by the metallic thud of shrapnel rattling off aluminum skin. The pilot, Lieutenant Harry Gunder, kept his voice steady over the intercom. "Hold tight. Stay sharp." The temperature inside the turret dropped below freezing. Smith's breath fogged his gun sight. He wiped it clear with a rag and scanned the sky. From the direction of Lorient came the first German fighters. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s diving in pairs out of the sunlight. They attacked from above and behind, where the bombers' defensive arcs overlapped the least. To survive, the gunners had to do more than react. They had to predict. At Harlingen Gunnery School in Texas, Smith had been drilled on the concept of firing behind the target. Instructors used camera guns and moving silhouettes to teach deflection, the art of aiming where the enemy would be, not where he was. A bullet took nearly a second to reach its mark. In that second, a German fighter could travel hundreds of yards. A perfect shot was not a straight line. It was an equation. The brain had to become a computing gunsight, calculating airspeed, range, and angle in an instant. The gunnery schools had turned science into survival. They called it deflection shooting in training manuals, but the men in the air gave it a darker nickname: the art of anticipating death. Smith had practiced on moving targets, strung between towers in the desert heat, shooting bursts of colored paint that would later be analyzed on film. Every miscalculation was recorded, every hesitation magnified. When he graduated, the instructors told him the same thing they told every gunner who left for England: "You will not have time to think. Trust the training. Fire where he will be, not where he is." Now, as the German fighters closed in, those lessons became instinct. Smith saw the flash of sunlight off a Messerschmitt's canopy, felt his pulse steady, and fired a short burst, not at the plane, but at the empty air just behind its nose. The tracers arced forward like glowing threads, intersecting perfectly as the German flew straight into them. The fighter exploded in a brief, violent flash. Then the flak found them. A shell burst directly beneath the fuselage. The explosion ripped through the fuel tanks, tore open electrical lines, and set the radio compartment ablaze. Fire spread in seconds. The intercom went dead. The bomber dropped nearly 1,000 feet before the pilot regained partial control. Smith's turret filled with smoke. He tried to rotate it, but the hydraulics were gone. He forced the hatch open and climbed into the fuselage. The scene inside was chaos. The radio operator was bleeding from the neck. The waist gunner lay unconscious. Flames climbed the walls and ceiling, threatening the oxygen tanks overhead. He had two choices: jump or fight. But the parachutes were already burning. So he grabbed a fire extinguisher and began to battle the inferno. He worked methodically, the way he had been trained, alternating between spraying the flames and dragging the wounded to safety. Each time he thought the fire was out, another section reignited as fuel leaked through bullet holes in the floor. The heat blistered the paint from the walls. Outside, the Luftwaffe circled like vultures. With the tail guns silent, the enemy saw an easy kill. 3 fighters broke formation and came in for the kill from low 6 o'clock. Smith dropped the extinguisher, raced back to the waist guns, and fired. The air filled with the rhythmic hammering of twin .5s. He used the same firing behind principle the instructors had drilled into him, leading not forward but backward through the arc of the attacker's approach. His tracers curved into the fighter's flight path as it pulled up too late. The Messerschmitt disintegrated in a burst of flame and smoke. He swung to the other side. Another fighter flashed by, close enough that Smith could see the pilot's goggles. He fired again, short bursts, never panicking, never overcompensating. He had to guess where the fighter would be a heartbeat from now. The rounds tore into the plane's wing root, and the German spiraled down in smoke. The fire behind him roared back to life. The oxygen tanks began to hiss. If they ignited, the entire bomber would explode. He beat the flames with his jacket, poured water from canteens, even used a tin of fruit juice to smother small bursts along the wall. When he ran out of water, he urinated on the burning insulation. Nothing mattered except keeping the fire away from the tanks. The pilot's voice finally returned on the intercom, faint and cracking through the static. "Is anyone alive back there?" Smith replied between coughs. "Still here." Still firing. For the next hour and a half, he fought alternating waves of flame and enemy fire. At one point, he was the only conscious man in the rear half of the plane. The top turret gunner had passed out from smoke inhalation. The radio operator bled out in silence. The tail section was riddled with holes, but whenever fighters approached, they found the B-17 still firing. By the time the bomber turned for home, 2 engines were out, the flaps frozen, and the control cables shredded. The crew counted over 3,000 holes in the fuselage. No one could explain how the plane stayed in the air. Smith kept firing until they crossed the English Channel. Only then did he allow himself to collapse beside the blackened remains of his turret. When the Mary Ruth landed at its base in Suffolk, it came in trailing smoke and fuel. Fire trucks raced alongside the runway as the wheels touched down. The crew chief who climbed aboard later said it looked like a flying skeleton. Aluminum scorched, cables melted, glass shattered. And yet the guns still faced outward, loaded, ready. They found Smith unconscious, his hands burned to the bone, his face blackened. When medics tried to carry him out, he insisted they help the others first. Only when everyone else was accounted for did he allow them to treat him. The official mission report ran to 12 pages. The investigators were skeptical at first. A single man fighting fires, tending the wounded, and defending a crippled bomber seemed impossible. But physical evidence backed every word. The bullet holes around the waist positions formed distinct patterns of return fire. The scorched bulkheads bore extinguisher residue. The floor near the oxygen tanks was wet. The story was real. 3 weeks later, Maynard H. Smith became the first enlisted airman in the 8th Air Force to receive the Medal of Honor. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action above and beyond the call of duty, while serving as gunner aboard a B-17 aircraft engaged in a mission over enemy territory." It detailed how he manned his guns after being wounded and extinguished flames that threatened to destroy the aircraft, thus saving the lives of his crew and the plane itself. In photographs taken that June, he appears almost uncomfortable, standing stiffly beside a general, his uniform pressed but worn, his eyes steady but distant. The medal glinted against his chest, a small circle of metal representing an act so large it defied description. What the citation did not mention was how his survival, and the bombers, was also a demonstration of the doctrine that would define American aerial warfare: calculated fire through prediction. His deflection shooting under impossible conditions proved that firing behind the target wasn't a theory. It was science in motion. After his recovery, Smith was transferred to a training post where analysts studied his engagement footage and mission report. The Air Forces were refining the new Sperry computing Gunsight, a mechanical predictor that calculated where to fire based on range, speed, and angle. Smith's after-action data, angles of approach, burst length, hit probability, became part of that program. Instructors at Harlingen cited his case during advanced lectures on lag pursuit, the counterintuitive method of aiming slightly behind an attacking aircraft so that the curvature of its flight would carry it through the bullet's path. The idea defied human instinct. Most men wanted to lead forward, to chase the target. Smith had shown that patience and timing could outthink speed. Letters from his squadron mates later described him as quiet after the mission. He rarely spoke of what happened over Saint-Nazaire. He returned to duty, but never flew in combat again. Officially, he was reassigned for public relations purposes. Unofficially, the psychological toll was too great. His commanding officer wrote, "He gave more than one man should have to give in a single mission." Back home, newspapers printed his story beneath headlines that called him the one-man Air Force. Reporters compared him to Audie Murphy. He hated the attention. "It was luck," he told one interviewer. "Just luck and training." But historians would later see his mission as more than an act of heroism. It was a moment when science, courage, and industrial ingenuity converged. By 1943, American gunnery had become a system of precision thinking. Every gunner, from the waist position to the top turret, was trained as part mathematician and part machine operator. They memorized tables of angles, bullet drop rates, and wind correction factors. They practiced until muscle memory replaced fear. The concept of firing behind, or lag aiming, became standard procedure for aircraft defense. The technological leap that followed was astonishing. The Sperry computing Gunsight, first installed on B-17 and B-24s later that year, used gyroscopes to calculate the correct deflection automatically. It turned every gunner into a living computer. The system relied on a principle Smith had already proven in the air. The shortest path to survival was not reacting faster, but predicting smarter. After the war, Smith faded from the headlines. He returned to civilian life quietly, working for the Treasury Department. He rarely spoke of the medal, and for decades his name appeared only in official records and training archives. But among aerial gunnery instructors, his mission lived on as the ultimate teaching story, a reminder that the deadliest precision could exist alongside the simplest human instinct to protect. In declassified after-action analyses from 1944, researchers cited Smith's engagement as a prime example of sustained controlled fire under catastrophic impairment of aircraft function. They noted how his average burst length remained consistent even under fire, an indication of total composure. No flinch, no spray, no panic, the report concluded. Each burst calculated, not guessed. His deflection patterns were compared with training range data and found nearly identical. The implication was stunning. A man operating under heat, smoke, injury, and psychological trauma had maintained firing precision equivalent to controlled conditions. The report concluded that such behavior could only result from complete assimilation of the firing behind discipline, the seamless blend of physics and instinct that defined the new air war. The story of Maynard Smith became part of a larger American transformation. Before the war, aerial gunnery had been considered crude, more art than science. The British used ring sights and estimation. The Germans relied on strict forward lead charts. The Americans, combining mass training with industrial computing, turned it into a precise craft. The air forces could now produce thousands of men who understood how to think in time and distance rather than fear and luck. Smith's flight had demonstrated the human side of that revolution. Beneath the roar of engines and the machinery of total war was one man, enclosed in steel and fire, calculating calmly through chaos. When historians reconstructed the mission decades later, using surviving logs and testimony, they realized that his bursts of gunfire had likely deterred several fighters from pressing their attacks. The Luftwaffe pilots, seeing steady return fire from a burning bomber, assumed reinforcements were near. That misjudgment allowed the crippled plane to escape. After the war ended, many of those same German pilots, captured, debriefed, or later interviewed, expressed disbelief that the B-17 had survived at all. One recalled seeing it burning but still firing. "We thought it was unmanned," he said. "No man could survive that heat." He was wrong. One man did. In 1945, Smith attended a reunion at an airbase in Florida, where new gunners trained on camera gun film loops of his mission. They watched a reconstruction showing his angles of fire overlaid on animation. The instructor told them he didn't shoot where the Germans were, he shot where they would be. And he stayed alive because of it. When Smith died in 1984, he was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. His grave marker bears only his name, rank, and the inscription Medal of Honor. No mention of the inferno, the gunfire, or the impossible odds. Yet his legacy endures in every technical manual, every museum display that teaches the logic of air defense. The story of Maynard H. Smith is not just a tale of bravery. It is the anatomy of precision under fire. It captures the essence of why American gunners learned to fire behind the target, and how that single innovation, mathematical, mechanical, and human, multiplied their effectiveness in the skies over Europe. Through smoke and chaos, inside a burning aircraft, one man became the living proof of a nation's industrial and intellectual power. He was not just fighting the enemy. He was embodying the shift from guesswork to calculation, from survival by instinct to survival by understanding. On that morning over Saint-Nazaire, Maynard Smith was more than a gunner. He was the first soldier of a new kind of war, one measured not by courage alone, but by the precision of those who learned to see beyond the present moment, to aim not where the target was, but where history itself was going. February 1943. At a small research building on the edge of Sperry Gyroscope Company's Long Island plant, a handful of engineers huddled around a strange-looking metal box. It was compact, no larger than a typewriter, yet inside its aluminum frame spun a series of gyros, gears, and potentiometers that could think faster than any human gunner. They called it the Sperry Computing Gunsight, and though few outside the company knew it then, this device would quietly revolutionize aerial warfare. To the engineers, it was a machine of mathematics. To the gunners who would soon use it, it was something close to magic. The air war over Europe had entered its deadliest phase. Every mission across the Channel meant facing coordinated German fighter attacks that came from every direction, head-on from the sides and most dangerously from above and behind. The formations of flying fortresses and liberators could put hundreds of machine guns in the sky, yet even with that firepower, most crews discovered how easy it was to miss. A fighter closing at 400 miles per hour gave a gunner less than 3 seconds to track, aim, and fire before it flashed past. At that speed, the human brain simply couldn't calculate where the enemy would be by the time the bullets arrived. The result was waste. Thousands of rounds fired for every confirmed kill. In 1942, combat analysis revealed a chilling truth. Most defensive gunners were falling behind their targets. The tracers that looked so perfect in the air were actually trailing through empty sky. The difference between a hit and a miss was a matter of fractions, fractions of a second, fractions of degrees, fractions of instinct. And instinct wasn't enough. The engineers at Sperry knew the problem wasn't courage or training. It was geometry. A gunner looking through a sight saw only where the fighter was, never where it would be when the bullets arrived. Every trigger pull demanded a prediction that changed with range, speed, and angle of approach. The math was brutal. The human brain had to solve a 3-dimensional equation in real time while the aircraft shook, the oxygen mask iced over, and flak bursts flashed outside the window. Sperry's engineers set out to mechanize that calculation. They were already masters of gyroscopic control, creating the stabilized bomb sight that allowed bombardiers to drop ordnance with uncanny precision. If gyros could hold a bomb steady at 25,000 feet, they reasoned, they could also hold a gun sight steady under fire. But they wanted to go further, to build a sight that didn't just stay level, but thought ahead. At the heart of the device were two small gyros mounted perpendicular to one another, spinning at 20,000 revolutions per minute. These gyros sensed motion across two axes, horizontal and vertical, and converted it into electrical signals that fed a tiny mechanical computer. The gunner input two things manually: the estimated range to the target, controlled by twisting a small knob that adjusted a reticle size inside the sight, and the target's wingspan, selected from a dial. Everything else, the lead angle, bullet time of flight, and rate of closure, was computed automatically. Inside, cams and gears translated those signals into precise corrections, moving the illuminated reticle in real time. As the gunner tracked a fighter, the reticle shifted subtly, floating ahead of the enemy's path. The gunner didn't have to guess the proper lead anymore. He simply kept the moving reticle over the target, squeezed the trigger, and the bullets arrived where the plane would be, not where it was. In that simple act, the impossible geometry of aerial combat became solvable. The first prototypes were tested at Eglin Field, Florida, in early spring. Engineers mounted the gun sight in the waist position of a stripped-down B-24 and flew simulated attacks using towed drones. Film cameras recorded the tracers while telemetry tracked every burst. The results stunned the observers. Hits that previously required long bursts were now achieved in half the time. Accuracy increased by nearly 70%. A gunner who had once been considered average suddenly performed like an ace. The test pilot, Captain Harold Burnham, wrote in his report, "The device eliminates human delay. It sees faster than the man can think." In May 1943, the gun sight was officially adopted. Production began almost immediately, with the War Department ordering thousands for installation in B-17 and B-24s bound for the 8th Air Force. Every major ball turret, top turret, and tail position would receive one. At the factory, the assembly lines moved in 12-hour shifts. Women technicians calibrated gyros under magnifiers, while machinists aligned the reticle housings to within thousandths of an inch. Each unit took 110 hours to produce and had to pass vibration tests replicating the tremors of high-altitude flight. By autumn, the first Sperry computing gun sights arrived in England. Crews at Bassingbourn, Thurley, and Alconbury received them with curiosity and skepticism. Many gunners preferred the familiarity of the simple ring and bead sight. They had been taught to rely on feel, to lead visually, to fire where instinct told them. But the instructors insisted. "Let the sight do the thinking," one training officer said. "You just keep it steady." The results spoke for themselves. Within weeks, after-action reports began noting dramatic improvements in kill ratios. Squadrons equipped with the computing sight reported that their gunners were shooting down twice as many attackers while using fewer rounds. German pilots began complaining of impossible accuracy from American bombers, unaware that they were facing not new men, but new machines. The shift was psychological as much as technological. The gunners began to trust the machine, and in that trust found calm. Instead of chasing fighters frantically across the sky, they learned to move slowly, smoothly, keeping the reticle centered even as their own plane shuddered. The gyros absorbed the turbulence. The computer compensated for drift. What had once been chaos became choreography. Over Bremen, a tail gunner named Private William Adams described the feeling in a letter home. "When they come in at 2 o'clock high, The reticle just slides ahead of them like it knows. You squeeze off a short burst and see pieces come off the Messerschmitt. It's like the sight is reading your mind. In training manuals distributed that winter, the Air Forces emphasized the new doctrine of predictive fire. Instead of brute force or volume, success came from synchronization, man and machine anticipating motion together. The phrase, firing behind the target, entered the vocabulary not as a mistake, but as a method. To strike a turning fighter, the gunner had to place the reticle slightly behind the plane's current path, letting the mechanical computer interpret the arc of motion and calculate where the bullets should meet it. The system's genius lay in how naturally it merged with human behavior. The gunner didn't have to solve equations. He simply followed the sight. The gyros handled the math invisibly, translating every tremor of the plane and every swing of the gun into precise offsets. The result was an almost serene form of combat, a dance of prediction, not reaction. Historians would later compare the Sperry site to the Norden bomb site in significance. Both used gyroscopic stabilization, both replaced guesswork with computation, and both turned ordinary men into technicians of precision. But the Gunsight's impact was more intimate. It lived at eye level, in the trembling hands of airmen who might not survive another mission. At the Sperry plant, engineers kept a wall covered with letters from gunners who credited the site with saving their lives. One from a B-24 crewman read simply, "I trusted your machine, and it brought me home." Another came from an instructor in Texas who wrote, "Your Gunsight made believers out of boys who thought math had nothing to do with courage." The device was not flawless. Its gyros required careful calibration. Excess oil could cause drift. Cold temperatures could stiffen the bearings. Maintenance crews learned to keep spare units preheated in the bomber's bays before takeoff. Yet even with those quirks, it represented a new philosophy, that victory in the air would depend as much on computation as on bravery. Combat footage from 1944 showed the transformation clearly. Where earlier missions displayed frantic, uneven bursts of tracer fire, later footage revealed smooth, measured streams, each one aligned with the predictive reticle's invisible logic. Analysis of recovered German wrecks confirmed higher hit concentrations near cockpit and engine zones, precisely where the sight aimed to compensate for closure speed. The Luftwaffe took notice. Interrogations of captured pilots revealed growing frustration. "They no longer miss," one said. "They shoot where I will be, not where I am." To the engineers back in Long Island, those words were confirmation of success. But they also knew that the Gunsight represented only the beginning of a larger idea. By mechanizing the human decision in combat, they had opened the door to a future of automatic warfare, machines that could think ahead faster than men. In late 1944, a Sperry representative named Frederick Schneiderman toured bomber bases across England to observe the site in combat conditions. He interviewed dozens of gunners who had survived repeated missions. His report captured a detail that statistics could not. Morale among gunners using the computing site is significantly higher. They speak of control, of confidence. The device gives them the sense that they can meet the enemy on equal terms. The power of prediction became psychological armor. The men no longer felt outmatched by speed. They could finally meet modern warfare's velocity with their own. By 1945, nearly every American heavy bomber carried the device, or one of its derivatives. Over the course of the war, production exceeded 40,000 units. Each one represented a fusion of human nerve and mechanical foresight, a partnership that defined the technological heart of the Allied victory. In the decades after the war, historians tracing the lineage of guided weapons found their roots here, in the quiet revolutions of gyroscopes and analog computation born from necessity. The Sperry sight anticipated not only better shooting, but the logic of automation itself. It was, in essence, the first predictive targeting computer. What it changed most, however, was perception. Before its invention, aerial gunnery was seen as a brutal test of reflexes and luck. Afterward, it became a discipline of calm precision. Crews were no longer simply fang into the chaos. They were sculpting trajectories through it, turning mathematics into defense. A former waist gunner recalled years later, "When you looked through that sight, it was like seeing into the future." The plane moved, the reticle moved, and somewhere in between was the moment that decided if you lived. It made time itself feel mechanical. Sperry's engineers could not have known how deeply their invention would echo. In post-war laboratories, the same gyroscopic and mechanical principles would evolve into radar guidance, missile tracking, and eventually digital fire control computers. The lineage of predictive fire stretched from that humming box in a Long Island workshop to the targeting systems of modern aircraft and spacecraft. But in 1943, none of that mattered to the men inside a fortress at 25,000 feet. All they cared about was survival. And the new sight offered a way to make the sky slightly less lethal. In one recorded mission over Schweinfurt, a B-17 tail gunner named Sergeant Harold D. Walker claimed 3 confirmed kills in under 4 minutes. Interrogators asked how he did it. His answer was quiet. "The sight told me where they'd be. I just pulled the trigger." After the war, when he was interviewed by the Army Air Force's film unit, he described the feeling of that moment. You see him coming in fast, and the sight just glides ahead of him. You don't even think. It's like someone else is steering your hands. You just hold steady and let the math do the killing. That was the essence of the new warfare, the merging of mechanical precision with human steadiness. The Sperry computing Gunsight had not made the gunner obsolete. It had made him more dangerous. In July 1945, the War Department quietly declassified the full design, allowing technical colleges to study its mechanisms. What they found inside was an elegant simplicity. No electronics, no servos, just gears, gyros, and the genius of translation. Motion into mathematics, mathematics into survival. It was a masterpiece of analog engineering, proof that computation did not begin with vacuum tubes, but with spinning steel. In the archives of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum today, one preserved unit sits behind glass. The metal casing is scuffed, the markings faint, the glass reticle slightly yellowed from age. But when curators gently tilt it, the gyros still whisper, faintly alive after 8 decades. The motion feels ghostly, as if the memories of every mission still hum inside. Visitors rarely linger, not realizing they're standing before one of the most influential instruments of the 20th century, a device that transformed guesswork into geometry and fear into calculation. The story of the Sperry computing Gunsight is the story of human adaptation under fire. It reminds us that even in the most chaotic environments, clarity can be engineered, that foresight can be built into steel. For every gunner who sat behind it, the sight offered not just a better aim, but a glimpse of a future where machines extended human perception beyond its limits. In the thin air over Europe, as bombers shook and flames tore through the sky, a small spinning gyro quietly made the impossible possible. It predicted the future 1 second at a time, and by doing so, helped turn survival itself into a matter of mathematics. When historians later asked those who survived what difference the new site made, their answers were simple. One veteran said, "Before, we prayed and fought. After, we just aimed." The difference between chaos and control had been reduced to a circle of light moving across a pane of glass, an illuminated reticle powered by gyroscopes, discipline, and the faith that prediction could defeat speed. And in that faith, born of desperation and perfected through design, America's gunners learned to do the impossible. They learned to fire behind the target and hit it every time. June 15th, 1942. Harlingen Army Airfield, Texas. The first light of dawn spread over the flat Gulf plains, painting the sand a dull amber. Rows of recruits in khaki stood at attention beside wooden barracks that still smelled of pine and varnish. Beyond the parade ground came the distant sound of machine gun fire, short, rhythmic bursts echoing through the rising heat. Dust drifted across the airfield where trucks rumbled toward the ranges, their beds filled with ammunition boxes and sweating trainees gripping .30 caliber Brownings. Here, under the relentless Texas sun, the United States Army Air Forces were building a new kind of soldier, one who would learn to shoot not at a target's present, but at its future. For the men who arrived that week, the base seemed endless. 6 square miles of desert fenced in by barbed wire and wooden towers, lined with barracks, classrooms, and hangars that shimmered in the heat. Some of the new trainees were farmhands, others factory workers, others still college students barely 20 years old. None of them had ever fired a gun at a moving object before. Yet within 6 weeks they would be expected to hit enemy fighters screaming toward them at 400 miles per hour. The old instinct, point, shoot, and hope, would have to die here. In its place, they would learn the art of deflection, to fire not where the target was, but where it would be when the bullets arrived. Every morning began the same way. Reveille at 0500, chow at 0530, roll call at 6. Then the march to the lecture halls, where the men sat on wooden benches staring at chalkboards covered in trigonometric diagrams. "You are no longer hunters," one instructor barked. "You are mathematicians. Your weapon is a calculator that happens to fire bullets." The men groaned, but they listened. On the board, a line representing an enemy aircraft crossed the screen at an angle. Another line, drawn by the instructor's chalk, represented the bullet's path. "This," he said, tapping the intersection, "is where life and death meet. If you aim here," he circled the aircraft itself, "you're already dead." At first, the concepts made little sense. Angles of approach, target crossing speed, bullet time of flight. Each term sounded like something out of a textbook, not a battlefield. But the instructors, many of whom had flown combat missions, knew how to make theory feel real. They would dim the lights and project films of actual dogfights onto the wall. Grainy footage of German Messerschmitts diving through formations of flying fortresses. "See that?" the instructor said, as tracers streaked behind the enemy plane. "That's a man aiming where the target is. And that," he paused as the film showed the same fighter erupting in smoke when a second gunner fired ahead of it, "is a man who learned to lead." Outside the classroom, the desert became a laboratory. Wooden towers rose from the sand, each topped with rotating targets pulled by cable. Trucks fitted with gun mounts rumbled across the dunes, simulating the rolling motion of bombers in flight. Overhead, AT-6 Texan trainers towed long white sleeves, canvas tubes hundreds of feet behind the plane, while students in the rear cockpits fired camera guns, their bullets replaced by 16mm film. Every frame captured the position of the gun's reticle against the moving target. After landing, the film would be developed and projected onto a classroom screen. The instructor's grease pencil drew red circles around each error. "Here," he'd say, pausing the reel. "You fired too late. The target has already passed the convergence point." Another frame. "Here you anticipated too much. You shot ahead of the enemy's turn." The criticism was relentless, but precision demanded it. By the end of the first week, the men's shoulders ached from the weight of their guns. Their eyes watered from the sand and glare. Sweat darkened their flight caps, but they were changing. Where once they saw a plane crossing the sky, now they saw equations, angles, distances, trajectories. The invisible geometry of survival had become visible to them. The flexible gunnery school at Harlingen was the first of its kind, but soon identical programs spread across America. Las Vegas, Laredo, Buckingham, Tyndall, Kingman. Each operated like an industrial assembly line for marksmen. Thousands of young men arrived every 2 weeks. Thousands more graduated, wings pinned to their chests, ready for combat. At its peak, the system produced nearly 40,000 trained gunners each month. It was the largest technical education project in the world, rivaling the scale of the Manhattan Project in manpower, though not secrecy. Its purpose was singular: to turn instinct into calculation and fear into discipline. Training at Harlingen lasted 6 weeks. The first 2 were spent on the ground, the next 2 in aerial practice, the last 2 integrating teamwork and coordination. Ground training emphasized the physicality of the weapon. The Browning .50 caliber weighed more than 60 pounds with ammunition. Trainees disassembled and reassembled it, blindfolded, learning to clear jams by feel alone. They cleaned each piece until it shone, not for appearance, but because sand in the desert could seize a firing pin faster than a bullet could fly. Every day ended with weapon inspection. A single speck of grit meant extra drills. One instructor reminded them, "A dirty gun kills more of us than the enemy ever will." Then came range practice. Targets zipped along wire tracks at speeds up to 200 miles per hour, crossing left to right, right to left, and overhead. The recruits learned to swing their guns smoothly, to follow through instead of jerking the trigger. "Lead and bleed," the sergeants called it. "Lad the target, bleed the barrel forward, keep firing as it passes through the sight." Every shot left clouds of dust and the smell of burnt powder hanging in the air. At first, the targets returned untouched, the bullets cutting wide arcs into nothing. But gradually, holes began to appear where there had been none. The instructors watched quietly. When a trainee finally struck dead center, his instructor marked the board with a chalk star. No applause, no words, just that small symbol of approval. By week 3, the men took to the air. They climbed into AT-18 Hudson trainers, modified bombers with multiple gun positions, and lifted off over the Gulf. The vibration was constant, the noise deafening. Sweat poured from their faces even before they fired. Then the tow plane appeared ahead, dragging the canvas sleeve like a comet's tail. "Target, 3 o'clock high," shouted the instructor through the intercom. The trainee swung the gun, sighted, and fired in short bursts. Tracers curved through the slipstream, arching ahead of the white sleeve. Each burst was a heartbeat, each miss a lesson written in smoke. After landing, the gunners counted bullet holes in the sleeve. Colored wax tips identified each shooter. The data was recorded meticulously. Rounds fired, hits achieved, percentage of accuracy. By the 4th week, the best trainees were hitting targets with less than 1 second exposure. Their bullets converged exactly where the target would be, not where it was. The human mind, trained through repetition and feedback, had learned to predict the future by fractions of a second. At Las Vegas Army Airfield, the program took on an even more scientific tone. Psychologists observed trainees, noting how fatigue affected aim. Heart rates were measured before and after firing to study stress response. Instructors discovered that breathing patterns influenced accuracy. Holding one's breath too long caused tremors that ruined alignment. So the men were taught a rhythm: inhale during swing, exhale during trigger squeeze. It became almost meditative, a controlled breathing cycle that steadied the nerves and smoothed the motion of firing. Some called it combat breathing, others simply the calm. Discipline extended beyond the gun. Every man learned to read aircraft silhouettes in seconds. Flashcards with black and white outlines of enemy fighters were held up in rapid sequence. Messerschmitt 109, Focke-Wulf 190, 0, Tony, Betty, Sally. The instructor's stopwatch clicked. A hesitation longer than 2 seconds earned a reprimand. Recognition could mean survival. Misidentification could mean friendly fire. By the 5th week, teamwork drills began. The trainees were placed inside mock bomber fuselages built from plywood, each position corresponding to real B-17 or B-24 gun stations: nose, top turret, waist, tail, ball. Intercom lines linked them together. The lights dimmed. Speakers blared engine noise and alarm bells. A voice shouted over the static, "Bandits, 12 o'clock high." Each man called bearings in sequence. 1 o'clock low, closing fast, 300 yards. The instructors evaluated timing, clarity, and coordination. The goal was to create a living organism of defense, every gunner covering another's blind spot. When performed correctly, their overlapping arcs of fire formed an invisible shield around the aircraft. When performed poorly, a gap appeared, and in that gap, the enemy lived. Some nights, the men watched newsreels from Europe. They saw footage of bombers limping home, wings shredded, engines on fire. The reality of what awaited them settled in. Every bullet they fired here, in the safety of the desert, was rehearsal for those moments when tracer fire would light the skies over Germany. "You'll thank this dust," one instructor told them. "It's softer than flak." The instructors themselves were a breed apart. Many had flown combat, but were reassigned after injury or exhaustion. Their faces were weathered, their tempers short. Yet beneath the toughness lay empathy born of experience. They knew that in the air, hesitation killed. One instructor, Master Sergeant Frank Doyle, had survived 23 missions over Bremen. When recruits complained about the heat, he simply said, "At 25,000 feet, it's 60 below. Enjoy the sweat." His lectures blended humor and menace. "A bullet doesn't care about excuses," he'd tell them. "It only cares about math." On weekends, the trainees had a few hours of rest. Some wrote letters home. Others wandered into the nearby town where shopkeepers welcomed them with cold Coca-Cola and jukebox music. The locals called them the boys who shoot at clouds. Few civilians understood what the training truly meant, but everyone sensed its urgency. The war was not distant here. It was audible in every burst of gunfire, echoing across the plains. By graduation, each trainee had fired thousands of rounds, studied hundreds of films, and memorized every possible attack angle. Their final test combined everything: live firing from moving trucks at radio-controlled drones swooping overhead. The targets, small model planes powered by engines, dived and rolled like real fighters. The gunners aimed through their Sperry computing sights, adjusting for range and speed. When the drone exploded in a burst of flame, the instructor simply nodded. The men cheered, not because of the spectacle, but because they knew the calculation had been right. The results of these schools were measurable. In early 1942, bomber crews often expended over 10,000 rounds for a single confirmed kill. By mid-1944, after the new gunnery training system matured, that number dropped to fewer than 3,000. Accuracy had doubled, survival rates climbed, formation discipline improved. The phrase flexible gunnery became synonymous with precision, but numbers told only part of the story. The men who emerged from these schools carried something deeper, a sense of belonging to a grand mechanical symphony. They were no longer individual shooters. They were components of the flying fortress itself. When one man fired from the tail and another from the nose, their bullets met in the sky like notes in harmony. In that synchrony lay safety, and sometimes salvation. Harlingen's base commander, Colonel Raymond Baird, described it best in his final report. "We are not teaching men to kill. We are teaching them to predict motion, to understand the mathematics of survival. When instinct fails, calculation endures." His words echoed through every classroom, every range, every flight. As the months passed, the desert transformed. Where once had been silence, there was now a constant rhythm of engines and gunfire. The ground shimmered with spent brass. The air smelled perpetually of oil and cordite. The men called it the music of graduation. Each casing on the sand was a note in the anthem of the air war to come. When winter arrived, new trainees replaced the old, repeating the cycle endlessly. Across the nation, the other schools mirrored Harlingen's intensity. In Las Vegas, snow sometimes dusted the ranges, but firing continued. In Florida, humidity rusted gun barrels overnight, demanding constant maintenance. In Arizona, mirages played tricks on the eyes, forcing gunners to learn depth perception anew. Everywhere, the lesson was the same. Precision is born from discomfort. By the time D-Day arrived in June 1944, over 300,000 gunners had passed through the program. Their presence changed the air war. German fighter pilots began reporting heavier, more accurate defensive fire from American bombers. Formation attacks that once succeeded now ended in disaster. Luftwaffe losses climbed sharply. What had once been called flying coffins became fortresses in truth. Each gunner, anonymous in his turret, carried a piece of the desert within him, the memory of sweat, dust, and endless corrections until perfection became reflex. After the war, most of the schools were dismantled. The targets were left to rust. The ranges turned back to scrubland. Yet their legacy endured. Veterans spoke of the training with a mixture of dread and gratitude. "Harlingen made you hate the sun," one gunner said, "but it also made you love being alive." Another recalled, "We learned to see time differently. A second was enough to live or die. That's what they taught us." In retrospect, historians would call the flexible gunnery program one of the quiet revolutions of modern warfare. The moment when combat training embraced science fully, when intuition gave way to data, and the art of shooting became an applied physics lesson performed under fire. The doctrine born here, anticipation over reaction, would later influence fighter tactics, missile guidance, even computer gaming decades later. But in 1942, it was just men, dust, and math. As the sun set on that first day of training in June 1942, the recruits trudged back to their barracks. Their uniforms were stained with sweat and oil. Some complained, some joked. Some simply stared at the horizon where the targets had vanished into shadow. Tomorrow, they would do it all again. Another 1,000 rounds, another lesson in prediction. The sergeant walking beside them glanced at the sky, now streaked with orange. "Remember," he said, "when the time comes, you won't be firing at what you see. You'll be firing at what's coming." They nodded, too tired to answer, not yet realizing that into those words lay the secret that would one day double their odds of survival and turn defensive chaos into mathematical precision. The lesson learned in the deserts of Texas, the principle that taught America's gunners to fire behind the target and win the skies of war. March 23rd, 1944. Kunming Airfield, China. The morning haze over the Yunnan Mountains carried the smell of fuel, sweat, and dust. Mechanics in stained khaki pushed bomb carts beneath the broad silver wings of a consolidated B-24 Liberator, whose nose art read Thunder Jug. The 4 engines coughed smoke as the crew performed their final checks. At the top turret stood Technical Sergeant Arthur J. Benko, 21 years old, his gloved hands resting on the twin 50 caliber Brownings that would soon shake the sky. The sun caught the edges of his goggles as he scanned the horizon, the invisible line between the safety of the base and the chaos waiting beyond the clouds. He had flown this route before, the hump toward Burma, the steaming jungles of northern Siam, the Japanese-held railways that supplied Rangoon. But each flight carried its own script of danger, written in tracer lines and split-second choices. Benko had learned early that survival depended on mathematics as much as courage. He fired not at what he saw, but at what his mind predicted. A habit burned into him during gunnery school in Harlingen, Texas. Those long days of heat and dust now existed half a world away, but their lessons had followed him across the Pacific. At 0730, the bomber lifted off, lumbering through the mist. Its shadow slid across rice fields and terraced hills. The flight plan was a long arc southwest toward Lashio, an enemy supply hub vital to Japanese logistics. Below them, the green wilderness seemed endless. Above, the sky opened into a pale blue dome. For hours, the droning of engines filled the fuselage like a heartbeat. Each man sat within his station as if welded there. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, radio operator, waist gunners, tail gunner, and Benko in his rotating turret at mid-fuselage, the pivot point of the entire machine. From that glass bubble, he could see everything. The long, gleaming wings stretching like the arms of a crucifix, the mountains rising in the distance, the faint glint of escorting fighters far below. The world moved in slow rhythm until a voice cracked through the intercom. Sharp, urgent, electric. "Bandits, 3 o'clock high." Benko swung the turret instantly. His twin barrels tracked the glints on the horizon. Japanese Ki 43 Oscars climbing into formation, their wings flashing white in the sun. 6 of them, then 12, then more. He steadied his breathing, adjusted the foot pedals to center his rotation, and began to calculate. The B-24 was heavy, flying at 190 miles per hour. The enemy fighters approached at nearly double that. The margin of survival would be measured in milliseconds. "Keep formation," the pilot ordered. "Maintain altitude." The first Oscar peeled off into a dive, screaming toward the lead bomber of the formation. Benko followed it through the turret sight, leading the target by an invisible line he could feel more than see. The tracers erupted, orange beads arcing ahead of the fighter's nose. The bullets reached their future before the plane did. The Japanese aircraft flew straight into them. Flame blossomed across its fuselage, wings folding as it spun downward into jungle haze. "Splash one," he said into the intercom, his voice steady. But there was no time for triumph. Another enemy slashed in from 9 o'clock low, firing 20mm shells that tore through Thunderjug's right wing. The bomber shuddered. Benko swiveled, compensating for the aircraft's roll, and squeezed again. The tracers curved like ribbons, meeting the attacker in a perfect cross. The enemy's left wing sheared off cleanly. The rest disintegrated in mid-air. 2 kills within 30 seconds. The radio operator called out, "They're everywhere!" Indeed, the sky was alive with motion. Fighters looping, climbing, rolling in coordinated pairs. Each one sought the blind spots between the Liberator's guns. Benko moved with them, his turret rotating in smooth arcs, the world spinning through glass. Sweat dripped into his eyes. The intercom crackled with overlapping shouts. "Tail, he's on you! Low right! Low right! Break formation!" But Benko ignored the chaos. His universe narrowed to velocity, angle, and prediction. He remembered his instructor's voice back in Texas. Don't chase him. Own his next second. The next second arrived fast. 2 Oscars dove together from above, converging on the cockpit. Benko led them, counting rhythmically, 1, 2, 3, and fired. The first fighter broke apart mid-dive. The second rolled violently, smoke pouring from its cowling. Its pilot bailed out, parachute blossoming like a white flower against the green mountains. That made 4 confirmed, possibly 5. The rest of the formation scattered. The mission continued toward La Chio, though riddled with holes. The waist gunners patched fuel lines with rags. The navigator wiped blood from his map. Through it all, Benko stayed at his post, scanning the sky for the next threat. They reached the target at 0940. The bomb bay doors opened. The Liberator released its load of demolition bombs on the railway yard below. The explosions flashed in slow sequence, rolling waves of orange and black. Anti-aircraft fire blossomed from the ground, black puffs forming a deadly ceiling. The bomber banked away, engines straining. Then the enemy returned. 12 more Oscars, freshly launched from Tungu, appeared on the radar scope. They climbed in disciplined formation, attacking head-on. Benko's turret hummed as he tracked them, adjusting elevation. He fired a long burst to test range. The tracers fell short, but the pattern was perfect. He raised his aim 3 degrees and waited. The formation held steady, coming straight at them. When they closed to 800 yards, he pressed both triggers and did not stop. The twin .5s roared, vibration shuddering through the aircraft's frame. Shell casings rained onto the fuselage like metallic hail. Smoke curled inside the turret. One fighter exploded instantly, another swerved upward, trailing flame. The others scattered, their coordination shattered. The waist gunners picked off the stragglers. Within minutes, the sky was clear again. When the crew finally turned for home, silence filled the intercom. The pilot's voice broke it softly. "Good shooting, top turret." "Real good." Benko didn't answer. He simply checked his ammunition belts, replaced an overheated barrel, and resumed scanning the sky. He never counted victories until the mission was complete. They landed back at Kunming at 13:30. Ground crews swarmed the battered aircraft. Bullet holes peppered the fuselage. One engine smoked continuously. Reporters arrived the next day to photograph the damage. In the debriefing room, intelligence officers confirmed 6 enemy aircraft destroyed by Benko's fire, with 2 more probables credited jointly. It was one of the highest single mission tallies by a B-24 gunner in the theater. Yet when asked about it, Benko only shrugged. "They kept coming," he said. "I just kept leading them." Over the next 5 months, he flew dozens of missions across the China-Burma-India front. Each flight was a lesson in endurance, 12 hours of heat, noise, and vigilance. The Japanese adapted their tactics, attacking in waves from multiple altitudes. But Benko adapted faster. His deflection shooting became legendary among crews. He studied approach angles on mission films, marking where tracers intersected the target's path. He calculated corrections for speed differences between aircraft types. Where others relied on reflex, he relied on geometry. By mid-1944, he was credited with 14 confirmed kills and several probables, placing him among the top gunners of the entire U.S. Army Air Forces. He was promoted to Staff Sergeant, then Technical Sergeant. Fellow airmen described him as calm to the point of eeriness. During attacks, he spoke little, merely called bearings in clipped tones, 2 o'clock high, crossing left, and the crew would adjust without question. But behind the statistics lay exhaustion. The CBI theater was brutal. Endless monsoon rains, supply shortages, disease, and heat that warped metal and minds alike. Many crews never returned. The Liberator's long range meant isolation. If damaged, it often could not reach friendly fields. Benko knew this, but flew anyway, volunteering for missions others refused. When asked why, he replied simply, "If we don't, someone else will die trying." On the morning of August 15th, 1944, his squadron received orders for another raid, this time against the docks at Moulmein. Intelligence reported new Japanese fighters in the area, possibly Ki-44 Tojos, faster and heavier armed than the older Oscars. Before takeoff, Benko inspected every inch of his guns, stripping them down and reassembling by feel. He cleaned each barrel with meticulous care, checked feed belts twice, and loaded ammunition himself. A crewman asked if he ever got scared. Benko smiled faintly. "Every time," he said. "That's how I know I'm still thinking straight." The bomber lifted off into a bruised dawn. Clouds stacked like mountains, lightning flickered within them. Visibility was poor. Over the Irrawaddy River, flak burst in uneven intervals. Then came the fighters, 12 Tojos diving from above, sun at their backs. The first burst of cannon fire ripped through the right wing. One engine caught fire. The co-pilot shouted for extinguisher pressure. The bomber lurched downward. Benko's turret spun to intercept. The new enemy aircraft closed faster than anything he'd faced before, over 400 miles per hour. He calculated instinctively, crossing angle 30 degrees, closure speed 600 feet per second. Led by 2.5 aircraft lengths, he aimed ahead and fired. The first Tojo disintegrated. The second dived beneath them, riddling the underside. The waist gunners returned fire, but the angles were wrong. Benko lowered his guns through the turret ring and unleashed another burst. The tracers cut a perfect diagonal through the air, catching the enemy as it climbed. It exploded in mid-loop. Then another fighter struck from directly astern. The tail gunner shouted he was jammed. Benko swiveled backward, firing over the tail, his tracers curving in brilliant arcs. The attacker broke off smoking, but its last shells struck the turret housing. Plexiglass shattered. A fragment tore through Benko's shoulder. He felt the sting, ignored it, and kept firing. For 20 minutes the duel continued, the bomber weaving through storm clouds, enemy fighters circling like sharks. When the last one finally fell away, the crew cheered weakly over the intercom. Fuel was leaking, hydraulics gone, but they were alive. They limped back to base at dusk. Mechanics counted nearly 200 holes in the fuselage. Intelligence confirmed 4 kills for Benko that day, bringing his total to 18. He downplayed it again. "We were lucky," he said. "They made mistakes." But those who had seen his shooting knew better. By year's end, Benko's name circulated through official channels. Commanders cited his precision as proof of the new gunnery doctrine's effectiveness. Statistical analysis showed that crews who trained under the revised lead-ahead system averaged twice the hit rate of those trained under older reactive methods. His combat films were studied frame by frame in stateside schools. Instructors pointed to his bursts as textbook examples of predictive firing, the gunner firing behind the target's current position in order to intersect its future. Yet to Benko, these abstractions meant little. What mattered were the men beside him, the pilots who kept the plane level under fire, the gunners who covered his blind spots, the mechanics who patched holes so they could fly again. He wrote home rarely, and when he did, the letters were simple. "Still flying, weather bad, crew good. Tell Dad I can hit a Sparrow with a .50 caliber now." When Japan's surrender was announced in August 1945, he was on leave in India. The news reached him in a mess hall crowded with cheering airmen. He didn't cheer. He simply sat quietly, staring at his hands, the calluses dark with gun oil. Someone asked what he would do after the war. "Sleep," he said, "then maybe teach." He did both. Returning to the United States, he spent several years training new airmen in turret operation, emphasizing discipline over bravado. His students remembered his calm voice and exact instructions. "Every target has a future position. That's where your bullet belongs." To them, he wasn't a hero. He was the standard. Time thinned the ranks of those who remembered the China-Burma-India front. But Benko's record endured. Official tallies credited him with 18 confirmed and 3 probables, making him one of the highest-scoring bomber gunners of the Pacific War. More important, his combat footage and debriefs provided empirical evidence that predictive fire, once controversial, was decisive. The doctrine shaped not only bomber defense, but post-war jet gunnery and even early missile guidance theory. When historians later summarized his career, they often emphasized numbers. But the men who had flown with him spoke instead of composure, the way he seemed to exist half a second ahead of reality. In every mission he demonstrated that courage alone wasn't enough. Only the fusion of intellect and instinct could match the speed of war. In 1951, during the Korean War, he returned to service as an instructor. Younger pilots, raised in the jet age, laughed at stories of the old propeller bombers. Then they saw the training films, grainy footage of a B-24's top turret swinging smoothly as enemy fighters exploded mid-air, and they fell silent. The lesson was timeless. Technology changes, but anticipation never does. Arthur J. Benko lived quietly after retiring from the Air Force. He rarely spoke of kills or medals. When asked what he remembered most, he said, "The sound. When you're firing right, there's a rhythm. You feel the bullets connect before you see them hit. That rhythm, half mathematics, half intuition, had defined his life. He died decades later, long after the echoes of those twin .5s had faded, but his story remained embedded in the lineage of American aerial gunnery. Every time a new recruit learned to lead a target, to aim not at what was but what would be, they were repeating his lesson. Back in 1944, over those green jungles of Burma, Benko had discovered the purest form of prediction, the moment when a man becomes part of the machine, when calculation merges with courage, when fear dissolves into focus. He had stood alone in a glass dome, the world spinning beneath him, and turned chaos into geometry. In that fusion lay the secret behind every American gunner's success, the reason they fired behind the target, and by doing so, changed the air war forever.